Welcome to another episode of our Personal Empowerment Premium Audio Series, Finding Yourself in Paradise. Hi, I'm Michael Benner, and our technical problem last week was a little bigger than we feared, so we're going to go one more week without Steve. He'll rejoin us next week as we pick up the series again. And in its place, we're going to share with you another one of our premium audio programs from the Ageless Wisdom Mystery School. This one I think you're going to really like. It's called the Pendulum Metaphor. It's a very rich allegory to help you understand the nature of relative truth and how it contrasts to things that may or may not be absolute. Also, we'll use the pendulum to describe the difference between spirit and matter. Stay tuned. It'll be a little longer than our regular program, about 85 minutes or so. It's the Pendulum Metaphor. And thanks again for your interest and support in the Ageless Wisdom Mystery School and our Finding Yourself in Paradise series at FocusedPassion.com. Stay tuned.
Well, aloha, and welcome to the Ageless Wisdom Mystery School. This is the premium training now for the next 90 minutes or so. We'll also have a meditation exercise for you near the end of the class today. The premium training is tuition-based, and yet by holding on to the either email notice that you received about the class today or the URL address and the password that you got on the thank you page when you enrolled, just maintain that, keep that handy, and you'll always be able to listen to the replay. You can even download this program as an MP3 onto your computer. You can then archive it in your music folders, your iTunes program, whatever you use for organizing your music and Audible books and such. Or you could put it on your smartphone, your iPad, your iPod, carry it around with you and listen to it multiple times. I think that the class today is a real important one. Our topic is the Pendulum Metaphor. I hope you had a chance to listen to the free forum that we just concluded, but if not, I will review it, and you'll very quickly get the drift of what we're talking about today. And fortunately, we do have the time to get into it a little more deeply. I was talking in the free forum about being introduced to the conundrum of Manichaean thinking or binary thinking, which I called the either-or mentality as a young man, sometimes referred to it as the limits of dualism, although dualism has a number of meanings in philosophy, psychology. But my first exposure was the frustrating love it or leave it chant that many of us faced in the civil rights or anti-war movement, particularly the anti-war movement that followed the civil rights movement in the 60s. Love it or leave it, the first time I heard that, I was really confused. I bought into it completely. Even though, I lived in a household and was brought up in an environment that was very liberal in that we were always looking at alternative points of view. I was not brought up by absolutist thinkers. My father, perhaps, especially when he got stressed out and angry, would tend to be sort of a black or white, everything or nothing kind of a thinker, but my mother being more calm. They never said as much, but the atmosphere was, well, wait a minute, there's got to be some alternatives here, some liberal middle between this extreme absolute right versus absolute wrong. How about some middle ground, some 50-50 deal, right? And if there's a third way, like a permutation or a variation, then maybe there's a fourth option and a fifth possibility. And so being challenged by love it or leave it a lot of us started thinking, well, wait a minute, what are the implications of this, and why is that so appealing? In the free forum just minutes ago, we talked about the natural dualism of physical reality. And you could see how Manichaean, everything or nothing, black or white, either or thinking, sometimes called binary thinking today, for the zeros and ones in binary math. Computers are all based on zeros and ones, existence and non-existence, on or off. I remember after 9/11, George Bush saying, you're either with us or against us. And I thought, that's not right. But many years ago, when I was a kid, I saw the appeal in that. And I knew inherently how dangerous it was. And yet I didn't have the words to speak about it. It wasn't until later when, as a broadcaster, as a news person, and sometimes DJ, but mostly I did news from college on. And then I started doing talk radio programs, public affairs, talk shows, and other kinds of talk shows that were as much about entertainment as information. And we did a lot of politics and a lot of controversial subjects. And again, I was confronted with these everything or nothing thinkers. Well, if you don't like it here, why don't you go to the Soviet Union, you commie? And I learned to be somewhat empowered in my ability to respond to that, to play with it even, and to point out the foolishness of what I tended to call either-or thinking. I didn't know the word Manichaean at that time. That actually refers to a culture, an ancient culture in the Middle East. It comes out of Zoroastrianism, which is an old Persian philosophy about good and evil and everything being one or the other, no middle ground. That's what Manichaean is. You might want to Google it or look it up. And I've already explained binary thinking and either-or thinking is sort of obvious. Everything or nothing and all differences or opposites tends to flow from that. And if you're like me, even if you never did a talk show, I'll bet you're frustrated by having to face people that think that way and are so defensive that they won't even entertain the possibility of a middle ground. To an absolutist, all differences are opposites. So if you disagree, no matter how minor the disagreement, you're wrong and they're right. The idea that you could both have a point escapes many of these thinkers. I suggested in the free forum today that this is part and parcel of a fundamentalist philosophy, that while we see this on the political left as well as the right, that it seems to dominate the right wing in its fundamentalism, not just politically right wing, but the whole idea of a conservative philosophy, a literal nature to all things. Things are either true or they're not true. There's no such thing as partial truth. But you see, what I came to understand through the study of philosophy and to some extent psychology and to a large degree just educating myself is that truth is actually relative. And I began to incorporate this nature of relativity, not Einstein's theory of relativity, but philosophical relativity. Responses like, well, wait a minute, hold on, that would sort of depend upon other factors, wouldn't it? I started using that successfully in the talk show. And I over the years, I got better at it, and it's so informed my life that every once in a while I want to do a program like this. Today we're called the Pendulum Metaphor, because the two ends of the pendulum really can represent the relative nature, the bottom weighted end of the pendulum, swinging wildly back and forth or around and around. All these, matters of degree, these variations. The top end of the pendulum, of course, is fixed and represents the absolute, which is a very interesting term in philosophy. Absolute is a reference in philosophy to the totality, the unified nature of all that is. It's often used by people who want to avoid the use of the word God only because it tends to be personified as a separated individual. The personification of the divine, or the personification of God as a separated individual, creates all kinds of problems. That means God as a concept is not just the source of all things, but is very remote and very separated and very far away. It means that the Creator creates something, but is not what it creates. That the idea that we see in fundamentalist or literal absolutist thinking is that a separated God created separated forms, but stands remote, very far apart, so that life is not very sacred if God is not in it. And it's easy to be inhuman and treat other people badly, much less hurt animals if they are creations of God. But if you see God not as the word God, this man, this giant man that lives on a cloud very far away, but the absolute, you're more inclined to understand divinity as being all things. That God did not create the animals and then stand apart, that God expresses itself now as the animal. The catness of God is in the cat now. The nature of God to want to be like a dog is in God now, that God could not be separate from its creation any more than you could draw a sketch or paint a painting that does not contain some part of you. Or if you sculpt some form, anything that you build or create, you could build a house, and still you are in the house. There's something of the Creator in its creation. And even if in appearance they're separated, the Creator and its creation, philosophically they're all part of one thing. So for this reason, the absolute often in philosophy is used to refer to divinity as a unified totality. Again, not instead of God, but maybe a more complete and more accurate term for the source, for the Creator, for the center of the circle, as I described in the free form. I think that's a very beautiful model, and I hope to come back to that. The idea that if you were an ant on a record player spinning around and around on the record, as you move toward the center of this revolving disc, moving at a constant speed, still you are going to be moving through space more and more slowly as you move toward the center of the record, because there's less space to move through in a given revolution. And if you continue infinitely to the very center of that spinning disk, there is perfect rest. And the idea that all of this frenzy and this movement and this activity is springing from and cycling around a point of perfect peace, where there is silence and rest in the very center, Well, that's a very sophisticated God principle. And if you just take a part of the arc of that spinning disk, you've got the pendulum, where the weighted bottom end of the pendulum is moving yin and yang, back and forth, this way and that way, but not to any extreme, right? The extreme of the pendulum always includes the influence of both ends of the swing. Just like the bar magnet, where there's no point on the bar magnet where you would not be experiencing a magnetic field that is at once both positive and negative. You can't get so far to one end of the bar magnet that it's all positive or all negative. So it's the magnetic field that unifies what would appear at first look to be the opposite ends of the bar magnet, right? So there's really three elements here, and now we've broken either-or thinking. You have the positive end of the bar magnet, or the unified end of the pendulum at the top. You have the negative end of the bar magnet, electrically opposite in terms of its polarity, corresponding to the bottom swinging end of the pendulum. And yet there's a third element in the bar magnet, the magnetic field, that unifies what would appear to be the opposite ends of the bar magnet, so that you now just have one bar magnet with one magnetic field. And that's the string, so-called, in the pendulum. I'd even like to talk today about how moving up the string, or the cable, whatever, of the pendulum from the bottom toward the top traces out a cone shape and corresponds both to the sacred spiral moving around and yet also moving up in all three dimensions, back and forth, around and around, but also vertically, right? Just like the cross has a horizontal member and a vertical member, right? This is how you break through the either-or thinking that is so frustrating about people that see everything as only black or white, only right or wrong. Now, here's where this all begins, I think, in philosophy. I think start here, step one in philosophy, breaking open the nature of the absolute in terms of only one right way and everything else is wrong, and to recognize the validity instead of relative truth, is to ask yourself or another, at what point does fast become slow? At what point does small become big? And immediately the voice in your head says, well, that depends. It's sort of like, is there really such a thing as jumbo shrimp? Right? What do we mean by jumbo? A jumbo jet? That's big. Jumbo shrimp? You wouldn't call that very big unless you had a little shrimp next to it. Usually the word shrimp includes a definition of being very small. So what's jumbo shrimp? We do this a lot with our language. One of the most bizarre uses in language is pretty awful and awfully pretty. Have you ever thought of that? How strange it is to say that's pretty awful or that's awfully pretty, right? That's awfully beautiful. That's awfully good. That's pretty bad. What? You see how confused we are? And there's no need for you to be confused. It's just like, Why doesn't anybody talk about it? Is what I'm saying really that deep, that profound, and that complicated? Well, of course not. It's actually quite simple. It's just that who are you going to hear it? Piers Morgan going to talk about this? Wolf Blitzer, he going to talk about it? I don't think so. You're not going to be exposed to it. And yet, to bust this contradictory thinking open and to begin to look at the shades of gray, or I like to say the rainbows of alternatives and options, of variations and combinations and permutations between everything and nothing, is very enriching. It suggests that bifurcation may be a good place to begin. To divide things into two is not a bad place to start. Again, the nature of a dichotomy, this way or that, the two halves of something, the polarities of a bar magnet, for example, makes perfect sense. And there are many situations or occasions where you could say, well, that's big enough for me or fast enough for me. It doesn't really matter if it is absolute big or absolute fast. The point is, there's also relative truth. Things can be relatively true, or the other way of saying that is, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, a matter of degree. The pendulum is a perfect example. If you remember your geometry, a circle is measured as 360 degrees. Half of that, 180, is a circle split in half. Half a circle. Half of the way around the circle is 180 degrees. A quarter of the way around the circle, of course, then would be 90 degrees, and the angle that is formed opposite that 1/4 of the circle is called a right angle, a 90-degree angle. Most of our architecture is built on the principle of right angles. Everything has to be plumb, vertical and horizontal, perfectly vertical, perfectly horizontal. In a 4-square world, the 90-degree angle is boss. The 90-degree angle rules. In fact, it's not as strong as a tetrahedron, which is based on triangles. And now we're getting into geometry that gets a little more complicated, trigonometry, calculus, and I'm not going to go there. I'm not qualified and I'm not prepared to go there. But if you remember some of your geometry and some of your trig and working with arcs, parts of a circle, and pi, and sine and cosine, and the angles that are opposite those arcs, and that was all really beautiful, and started with Pythagoras and his attempt 2,500 years ago to define space. And that Pythagorean theorem about the right angle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the square of the hypotenuse equal to the sum of the square of the opposite sides that form that right angle. That's really sweet. That's really cool stuff. And we teach it to teenagers. Kids 12, 13, 14 years old can learn basic geometry and calculus and trigonometry. So it's no big deal. It's just a matter of sitting down and teaching somebody about the relative nature of things. It's not just this or that. And yet often we graduate high school, college, grad school, and go out into the world and have to deal with people that say things like, love it or leave it. And Like our president after 9/11, you're either with us or against us. Well, no, wait a minute. I'm with you, but I'm against your policy. I fall somewhere between the cracks. I'm in the middle, right? I'm with you in that I sympathize that this was a horrible thing, but I don't think bombing people in Afghanistan is the appropriate response. So I'm with you, but not in that regard, much less going into Iraq. Well, now you're painted as a being less patriotic or unpatriotic, or you're a traitor to your country. The idea that you can oppose war is used by the right wing to suggest you also fail to support the troops. In fact, this is a trap that we fell into, many of us, in the Vietnam era, but managed to avoid being smarter, learning the lesson when the Iraq War came around, both the first Iraq War with Papa Bush and then the second Iraq War with Baby Bush. We were smart enough to say, well, no, of course I support the troops, the men and the women that are making the sacrifice, that joined in the first place because they couldn't find a job in this rotten economy that's been destroyed by these conservative policies. We even saw an attempt in the collapse of 2008 to blame the victim, the people who lost their homes. It was their fault. The fact that it happened because of bank fraud, right? Again, this Manichaean idea that there's only two sides. What side are you on? Are you on the side of the banker, or are you on the side of the people that lost their homes? Well, philosophically, you can understand both, the extremes and everything in between. So the idea that there are absolutes in the physical world has to be challenged by those who are flexible enough in their thinking to recognize the relative nature of truth. When does fast become slow or slow become fast? Well, it's relative. It's a matter of degree. When does big become small? When does large become little? It depends. What are you talking about? Battleships, jumbo airplanes, or jumbo shrimp? Right? The macro world of galaxies and clusters of galaxies and billions of stars being hundreds, thousands of light years apart, or the micro world. Turn the telescope around and look down into the micro world where you see life forms that are a single cell and too small to ever, far too small to ever be seen with the naked eye. And you see an electric car and you say, it sure is tiny. Well, not compared to a single-cell creature, it's not tiny. See? So anybody with a modicum of intelligence, if pressed, if put in a situation where enlightenment and education is honored and respected, has to challenge the absolutism of the fundamentalist, and I'm sorry, I must say, simple-minded thinker. It is not only fundamental, not only reactionary, it is simple-minded to believe in absolutism. And yet a philosopher will hasten to add, there is such a thing as absolute, it's just not of this world. Absolute is a theoretical state that exists as a correspondence to spirit, to the metaphysical source, to the creator, to God in heaven. Except, as I mentioned, many people have a problem thinking of God as a giant man. God is spirit, not form. A Christian could say, well, God took form as Jesus. But the Father aspect, they would have to agree, is spirit. Well, how do you think of something that's everywhere equally present? Well, attempts have been made in the past. It's been called the ether. It's been called the ocean. In Islam, God as the ocean, or divinity as the unlimited, unbounded ocean, is often used. The ancient Greeks used it as well. Socrates talked about the ocean of things, or the adjective oceanic. But it doesn't mean an ocean that even has a shoreline. It's an unbounded, unlimited ocean. Or the atmosphere, in the same way. If you've ever wondered why the archetypes in dream symbology of fish and birds corresponds to the soul, is that the birds fly in the air and the fish swim in the ocean, and the atmosphere and the ocean correspond to the ethers, that is spirit, the everywhere equally presence of God, of divinity, not God as a man. So philosophers go, I have a real problem with this, that painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, God reaching out from someplace else. We need to have a better word. And so divinity is absolute. And in our model today, the pendulum metaphor, that would be the upper end of the pendulum, or the center of the circle. So if we can accept, by looking at when does fast become slow, when does big become small, if we can get a foot in the door there and begin to look at the relative nature of truth, that there may be such a thing as absolute truth, but it's not of this world. Acknowledge the point. The only absolutes are spiritual. Absolute is a word that means God as everywhere equally present, the ocean, the atmosphere, the everywhereness, all things being sacred. Not just God created this separated thing, but God is that separated thing, is an emanation of divinity. So that makes every human being sacred, every animal sacred, every tree, every flower, every rock, an emanation, not a separated creation, but part of the present radiated nature of that which is divine. It's a much more mystical view than our ancestors have had. And now that we've been exposed to the miracle of radio and television and its spin-offs like radar and sonar, we can begin to think, let's keep it simple, radio, without wires, wireless communication, right? Or watching, when people used to have TV antennas, now we have cables, but we used to have TV antennas on the roof, pictures through the air. And people go, oh, well, I can relate to that now. I can begin to understand the miracle of something, some kind of energy being everywhere equally present. If you have an antenna on your car, whether it's that vertical stick we used to have, or embedded in the windshield as they now do, you drive the car around town, everywhere you go, you're listening to the same radio station. That radio station is equally present. And the next day you can drive all over town listening to a different radio station. And everywhere you go, there it is. How come they don't get mixed up? If all those radio stations and TV stations and all the other radio that's out there, people on walkie-talkies and cell phones, people don't like to think about cell phones being radios, but they really are, right? If they're all out there, everywhere equally present, why don't they get all jumbled up? Why don't they get mixed up? What keeps those radio signals discrete even though they're everywhere equally present? And the answer is their frequency. Each vibrates at a different rate. Now, again, I'm not going to go into deep radio theory here about the nature of that particular energy called RF, right, or radio frequency. It's very different from alternating current or direct current. It's very different from electricity moving along a wire. It's more akin to the magnetic field that stands around the electricity, the current, every time it moves along a wire. Whenever electricity moves, there is a magnetic field around it. Radio is akin to the magnetic field, not the electricity. And it's everywhere equally present, and the fact that they don't get all jumbled up is a function of each having a different frequency, like notes on a piano keyboard. Each one of those notes is discrete, and someone with perfect pitch can tell you the name of the note just by listening to it. So, oh, that's A below middle C. Oh, that's a C sharp. That's an E flat. How do they know? Well, they have trained themselves, or maybe they inherited an ability to sense the frequency, the vibratory rate of that particular note. Well, this is a big opening into mysticism and metaphysics and the understanding of the physicalness of the universe, not based so much on the periodic table and the number of electrons and protons and neutrons in this element or that element, hydrogen, helium, zinc versus nickel versus tin versus lead. I mean, what's the difference between lead and gold? They're both metals. Lead is cheap, gold is expensive. What's the difference? Is it the number of electrons? Well, most chemists and physicists would say yes. But a metaphysician would say, well, no, they're different frequencies. Gold is a higher frequency than lead. So lifting lead to gold is a metaphor also, or turning water into wine, or the nature of yeast to lift bread, right? These have all been used and continue to be used to talk about this transmutation, this uplifting resurrection, if you will, of frequency. I don't want to get off on a tangent, but it's an important concept for you to be familiar with if you're going to think in terms of the totality of things as absolute. But there is a need to refer, in addition to the absolute or the ocean or the total set of all possibilities, to think of a subset. And this subset is different from that subset. So this is the relative nature of truth. Well, big becomes small. What are you talking about? That's sort of a relative concept. Isn't it a matter of degree? Fast becomes slow. It depends on what you're talking about. It's a matter of degree. And now we're back to the geometry and the simple trig. A matter of degree. A pendulum is an arc. It's part of a circle. As I said in the free forum today, if you imagine a playground swing and a child swinging back and forth, they might only swing through 15 or 20 degrees of arc. I can remember as a kid trying to get as high as possible. Really? Did you ever do that? Really pumping your legs, trying to see how high you could get. Boy, and sometimes if you get way up there, the chain that connects the seat of the swing, the weighted bottom of the pendulum, to the top would go slack a little bit. And then when you drop, that's where the mathematics of this gets a little complicated and you have opposing forces. You have the centrifugal force of the bottom of the swing or the pendulum, and then you have gravity itself, and like the nature of an orbit, right? Or swinging a bucket of water around and around. You swing that bucket of water over the top of your head, as long as you don't stop, the water will stay in the bucket even though it's above your head. You go too slow, the water will fall. You'll get wet. But if you go fast enough, the centrifugal force is greater than the force of gravity. Well, you have that same opposition of forces in the swing. So if you pump high enough in a playground or backyard swing set, you can get to the point where the gravity overwhelms the momentum, the inertia, and the centrifugal force of that swing going out. The chain goes slack, and you fall pretty quickly for a short distance until the chain is taut again. But what if you could go all the way around on the swing, like swinging the bucket of water over your head? You see, the pendulum is now understood to be just a part of that whole circle. The pendulum itself is a matter of degree. The pendulum metaphor, the title, the topic that we're talking about today, is really rich and beautiful because while most people talk about the bottom end of the pendulum as an example of polarities, of the yin and the yang, of the ebb and the flow, the in-breath and the out-breath, the positive and the negative, that would be the horizontal polarity. There is a vertical polarity. And the vertical polarity is the relative and the absolute. The matter of degree at the bottom, or the outside circumference of the cycle, of the circle, the bottom of the weighted pendulum, versus the absolute, and the unity of the top of the pendulum as the center of the circle, don't you see? And as I've already said, the center of a revolving spinning disk is theoretically at rest. Now, you could never get there. You can't get to absolute rest because it's an infinitely small point. But theoretically, there is a point so small it takes up no space, it does not even exist in the four dimensions of space and time, and yet all of this timing and all of this space springs from and dances around that point of no space, no time, absolute silence, absolute rest and peace in the middle. It's geometrically a beautiful, beautiful concept. And so if we just take a little pie slice out of that circle, we've got the pendulum. And the corresponding nature of the absolute, the fixed top end, and the relative nature of the bottom weighted end. You also have a model for understanding the relationship of unity to diversity, of spirit to matter, of God to man, of heaven to earth. Now let's talk about unity and diversity for a minute. I've spent a lot of time on the absolute and the relative, a matter of degree. When this fast becomes slow, depends. Let's talk about unity and diversity for just a minute. Because again, to a fundamentalist, absolutist, everything or nothing thinker, unity and diversity are opposites. Well, come on, they'll say, things are either unified or they're diverse, as if unity depends upon everything being alike. How would you define unity? Excuse me, let me take a sip of my coffee here. You might say, well, unity is where everybody agrees. Unity is where everybody is the same, thinks the same, where there's no disagreement. If anybody disagreed or there was any variation, you would not be unified. Really? And who are the forces? What are the forces that would have you believe such nonsense? Socially and politically, you might want to take a look at who is pushing that agenda. Who is it that wants to divide the united, the unified states based on the idea that there is one right party line, and if you disagree, you're wrong? That's not at all what unity is. And I think, if you look at the environment, at what we call the ecosystem, the food chain, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. The strength and the power of the ecosystem to support many forms of life comes from the fact that there are many forms of life. The strength of a unified system requires diversity. I did a program on this about a year ago. I called it, trying to remember if I called it the strength of diversity or the strength of unity. But I talked about both. I talked about the relationship of unity to diversity and the way in which unity and strength and power, unification, requires diversity. And if something gets homogenized, it becomes weak. This is why you're not supposed to marry your cousin, right? There are taboos upon people who are related getting married and having children because the strength of a human being, its health and longevity, is a function of having to come from a diverse gene pool. And if the gene pool becomes homogenized or less and less and less diverse, then it causes health problems in the offspring, whether it's human beings or like animal breeders. Have you seen what they've done to some of these dogs? I think there's probably room for breeding dogs if that's what you want to do, although we have way too many dogs and cats, but people breed them for money. But many of these dogs are, quote, overbred. The nervousness of an Irish setter, for example, or the tendency of terriers to bite and bark, or the tenacity of a bulldog, a pit bull, the incredibly beautiful coats that some dogs have. These features are the result of inbreeding. But there's always a trade-off. There's always a trade-off. And many of these dogs are overbred. As beautiful as golden retrievers are, for example, and I've had 3 of them in my life, 2 on my own, 1 with my wife, they're incredible animals, one of 4 or 5 kinds of retriever. Bred not only to retrieve, because they have this natural soft mouth, they have webbed feet, they're very good swimmers, and I think all retrievers are beautiful, but the golden is particularly beautiful, and yet they're prone to hip dysplasia. And it's pretty hard to find a golden that doesn't develop hip dysplasia and suffer pain as a result of an arthritic kind of condition that comes from being overbred. If you go back to middle school or high school and review your biology, you probably read about Mendel, who experimented with crossbreeding peas. And I've seen some conservative politicians recently make fun of experiments with fruit flies, like, oh, the government is wasting its money. Can you imagine on something as foolish as crossbreeding fruit flies? Well, we did that in high school, didn't we? Why do you crossbreed fruit flies? Well, because they breed in a matter of weeks, and because you can follow their traits. You could take two fruit flies that have similar markings, breed them, and look at the offspring. Take two fruit flies that have very different characteristics, breed them, and look at their offspring, and learn about genetics. That's what Mendel did with the peas, and that's why fruit flies are so often used in these experiments about genetics, because they breed so quickly. You might want to get the word to Sarah Palin on that. She skipped school that day. So they try to make political hay out of this, right? And yet the irony is they're coming from a place of unified thinking. They don't honor or appreciate diversity. There are some progressive people that don't get it too. It just seems to really dominate the so-called fundamentalist, conservative, absolutist thinkers that they recognize unification as a power, but not diversity. They don't like diversity. You're different, and different is bad. No, it's not. Different is good. Different is very, very good. There may be occasions where difference is bad. There may be occasions where similarity is bad. We're back to pretty awful and awfully pretty, aren't we? Jumbo shrimp. It's just the foolishness of humanity that we haven't educated our people. Here, hundreds of years ago, Mendel understood this by breeding peas. And hopefully you studied that in junior high school, or certainly in high school. And the understanding that came from that, the reason we were exposed to that, was to understand that power and strength in unity comes from, is born of, and dependent upon diversity. So as species of animals become extinct, the whole ecosystem is threatened. As species of plants become extinct, it starts a chain reaction that ripples through the environment, through the ecosystem, and makes it more susceptible to total collapse. And you say, well, why is that not more apparent to the simple-minded? Why don't they see it? I remember attending a lecture by the late Buckminster Fuller in it would have been the late 1970s or maybe the early 1980s. Bucky, unfortunately, is no longer with us. Brilliant man, the inventor, in a sense, or founder of geodesics, of the dome, and many other contributions. The Dymaxion automobile, which is a three-wheeled automobile with a triangular base, very, very stable. The Dymaxion map of the world that put the North Pole in the center of the map and allowed us to see that we're really an Earth island, understanding that in the past, commerce went around when there were ships, but now that we rely on airplanes, we go over the poles, which changes everything, our whole orientation. Our world maps should not have the equator in the middle. They should have the North Pole in the middle. That would change everything. Fuller was a brilliant man. And Bucky talked about the importance of diversity in the ecosystem, in the environment, this way. He said, imagine you're on an airplane and one of the rivets pops out. Well, you wouldn't even know it. and the airplane maintains its integrity. This was a very important word to Bucky Fuller when he talked about domes. He talked about structural integrity from the point of view of an engineer, and then bridged it to personal integrity in the way people act, behave, and think and feel. He said, and then a second rivet pops out of the airplane, and everything's cool. The engines didn't fall off. Not yet. The wings are still attached. You're only missing 2 rivets. You're flying through the air just fine. And then pop, 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 a couple of more rivets come out. And you're still flying through the air. And then pop, 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 pop. A few more rivets come out. Obviously, there's a point where that airplane loses its integrity and falls apart. And now you go falling out of the sky. Sorry to have to put that image into your mind if you have fear of flying, but the point is rivets don't usually come out. And yet that's what happens every single day on this planet when dozens of species of plants and animals, many of them microscopic, too small to see, become extinct. And you might say, well, wait a minute, I thought extinction was natural. I mean, what happened to the dinosaurs? Human beings didn't do that. That wasn't global warming. Well, we're not sure what happened to the dinosaurs. It looks like the Earth may have been hit by a very big asteroid, and the atmosphere filled with so much dust and dirt that it became very cold and inhospitable. In many ways, the opposite of what's happening now with climate change and the greenhouse effect from all the outgassing of carbon dioxide. It traps the rays of the sun. And you say, well, I don't care if the world gets a little warmer. I'd like less snow to shovel in the wintertime. Yeah, well, the poles are melting. And so we're losing polar bears. You say, well, so what? So what if we lose polar bears? Well, what happens to the seal population? It gets too big, and then everything gets out of whack, you see. And what took millions of years for evolution to accomplish, where extinction is part of the natural process, when it gets distorted and accelerated by human activity, we could very easily create for ourselves an environmental collapse because of a lack of diversity. Because unity depends in the environment, in the ecosystem, on diversity. They're related, just like the fixed end of the pendulum is related to the bottom end that swings so widely. They're part of one whole thing. The absolute and the relative, the unified and the diverse. And in the same way, this corresponds to spirit and matter, or to what Einstein called energy and mass. You see, where the fixed top end, the center of the circle, or we're talking about this little pie slice that is the pendulum swinging, or the center of the circle or the fixed upper end of the pendulum corresponds to the unified nature of spirit everywhere equally present, while the swing of the pendulum at the bottom corresponds to the material world and all of its separated forms. You see, in the material world, the world of mass, I call it spirit and matter. A physicist refers to energy and mass. In the physical world, with these separated objects, no two objects can occupy the same space at the same time. That's the bottom of the pendulum. But the top of the pendulum is unified. Spirit, ocean, atmosphere, the oneness, everywhere equally present. Two objects can occupy the same space at the same time. Right? two clouds moving together, pouring two buckets of water into the same pan. They occupy the same space at the same time because they're not material objects. Well, technically, water is a material object, but it's a liquid. You understand the extremes here, the contrast that I'm drawing. And so the idea that the top of the pendulum corresponds to spirit or energy, the bottom corresponds to the material world or to mass, similarly is a rich allegory. Not opposites, like opposite good versus bad, the good guys and the bad guys, the cowboys and the white hats, and the cowboys and the black hats, but part of one whole thing, the center of the circle versus the circumference of the circle, the top of the pendulum to the bottom of the pendulum. And again, this even goes to an esoteric understanding of the cross, the very tree upon which Christ was nailed. It has a vertical member that corresponds, like the pendulum, to heaven and earth. And the horizontal member of the cross is the variations and the diversity of existence along the horizon on the earth itself. That's what the cross meant in pre-Christian times. And that cross, that was a tree. We have the arbor vitae, the tree of life, in so many cultures, dozens of different cultures around the world refer to the tree as a symbol of life, sometimes portraying the tree as being ultimately upside down, rooted in heaven and growing down toward earth. Although if you pulled a tree, if you were a giant and could reach down, grab a tree by the trunk and pull it out of the earth, and then shake the dirt off of the roots, it would look very much like a bar magnet, wouldn't it? The branches of the tree going out are not very different from the branching out of the root system. And you have the vertical trunk, the bar magnet of the tree, that has its polarities, reaching for the sun on the top end, the spirit, so to speak, the positive polarity, and reaching down into the earth with the roots, the so-called negative, but not bad, negative in terms only of polarity, not good or bad. And so the tree represents a vertical connection between sky and earth, between spirit and matter, between God and man. The law of correspondence, as above, so below. And what connects the above and below? Above what and below what? Well, above and below the middle. And what's the middle? The tree, the bar magnet, the pendulum, the vertical member of the cross, with its opposite polarities corresponding to the absolute, capital A, and the relative. Apply this in thinking, and you know the answer of when fast becomes slow. It's relative, because fast and slow are down here at the bottom end of the bar magnet, right? And you have a beautiful model for unity and diversity, for spirit and matter, heaven and earth. It allows you to understand. You know that picture, have you ever seen that painting by William Blake? I think it's Blake, of God with his beard blowing in the wind, reaching down from heaven with calipers. You know what calipers are for measuring distance? Not unlike a compass. I don't mean a magnetic compass. I mean the kind of compass you use to draw a circle. Well, think about that. The center of the compass is used to define unity, absolute peace and stillness, no space in the very center of the circle. And then you rotate that compass, you spin it with your fingers, and the other end of the compass proscribes the circle around it. In many ways, that's like a pendulum. Imagine that Blake painting where God is reaching down not with calipers, but with a pendulum. It's a rich and wonderful metaphor, and it'll help you break out of the Manichaean absolutist thinking that limits and severely cripples the understanding of so many human beings. It promotes fear. That's why it's so distressing, because absolutist thinkers that believe in all affairs there's an absolute right and an absolute wrong, and absolute good and absolute bad, and everything to them is absolutely one right way. And again, I'm going to say, you do see this on the left, politically, socially, but mostly on the right. I mean, one of the definitions of liberal, the reason we call education liberal arts, is you're taught, you're not indoctrinated, as the right wing suggests, by education. You're taught that diversity enriches you, like the ecosystem, that people or concepts, ways of thinking that are different from yours don't have to be a threat to you. They could enrich you. For example, what manner of intelligence is it that causes people to choose the religion of their parents and society in general? So that if you're born in Calcutta, you know that Hinduism is the one right religion, and if you're born in Peoria, Illinois, you know that Jesus died for your sins. But the Hindu hasn't studied Christianity, and the Christian knows nothing of the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, right? And yet each is so certain that their religion is right. I mean, what if one kind of mathematics prevailed in the Western Hemisphere and a whole different kind of math and science existed on the other side of the world? Wouldn't you want to know about it? Don't you think a medical doctor would want to know about acupuncture and herbs and cupping? Don't you think the Ayurvedic doctor of the East would want to know about pharmacology? What is it about the provincial nature of human beings that we see some advantage in remaining ignorant and refuse to study, to embrace the differences and the diversities as informing you? Even though many of us aspire to a world that cooperates and gets along, we still have to have respect for self-determination and sovereignty and keep alive the various cultures of the world. I mean, there are some concepts that can be better expressed in one language than another. We are not benefited by being an English-only speaking society. What if it's easier to express this particular concept in Greek or in Chinese? We should have access to those different languages and those customs and those belief systems and those religions and philosophies and worldviews. Diversity is a beautiful thing. It is a function of unity, as unity is a function of diversity. They're complementary, just as the left hand and the right hand appear to be opposite. Not just different, but opposing. They can work together in harmony. And in many ways, harmony is the third element. Harmony is the consciousness aspect, or the love. It is the chain and the playground swing between the bottom of the swing and the top of the swing. Harmony is that which stands between unity and diversity, between the absolute and the relative. In Eastern philosophy, it is known as the third way, or the middle way. And we can honor the absolute nature of spirit and the power of unification, provided we understand its relationship to diversity and the relative nature of truth. There's a famous quote by the Dalai Lama where he compares Eastern philosophy to the Judeo-Christian and Islamic religions in this way. He said those monotheistic religions, I can only paraphrase, I don't know the exact quote, but he's talking about the Abrahamic or monotheistic religions of the West, Judaism, the Hebrew religion, Christianity, and Islam, as being very absolutist in nature and believing in absolute truth and the one right way. He said the difference is that while we respect that and understand its role, and the fact that we would capitalize absolute, but we would not capitalize relative, he said the difference is we understand that there's also such a thing as relative truth. The dictates of your conscience, for example, have to sometimes trump the law. If you're taking somebody to the hospital and they're very ill or seriously injured, you might want to consider violating the law known as the speed limit. And yet, still, you got to remember you're putting other people in danger. So you may want to go faster than the speed limit, but how much faster? Well, it would be a matter of degree. And are you still going to run through the school zone at 80 miles an hour? Well, I might go faster than 25 because I have this dying person in the car, but there's kids running around here. It's a 25 zone. Maybe I'll go faster than 25, but not 80. You see? Laws are great examples of absolute. Well, you broke the law. You know, there's no wiggle room. It's the law. You drive 55, I'm a law-abiding citizen, they say, driving 65 miles an hour into 55. No, you're not. Oh, well, that law, that one doesn't count. It's relatively less important than these other laws. And yet they argue that there are absolutes. You see, absolutes, when they serve you, when you want to make someone who disagrees wrong, but relative truth when it suits you. And we're so confused, like I say, what is it with language that we can use terms like pretty awful and awfully pretty and not even think twice about it? Pretty awful and awfully pretty. I'm sorry, I keep going back to that. To me, again, it's like jumbo shrimp or military intelligence. There's another one. There's nothing intelligent about killing people who disagree with you and wrapping it in the flag and making it a noble endeavor. And disagree about what? Life and death? No, we disagree basically about economics. So we're going to dehumanize these people, call them horrible names, drop bombs on their children, kill all these non-combatants because their idea of economics is different. And most Americans go along with that. Right? Let's do a relaxation exercise. Let's integrate this. Let's go to the center of the circle, huh? Let's go to the top of the pendulum in meditation and contemplation. Still the body, quiet the mind, and calm the emotional nature. And get a more clear understanding, one that you can integrate forevermore in your life. And release the frustration of dealing with the absolutist, the Manichaean either-or thinker, the everything or nothing, dare I say, fool. In ourselves, for it is appealing, and in our friends in a loving and compassionate way, that we might lift the veil and reveal to them the relative nature that works in harmony with absolute. Just as the pendulum represents an arc of the circle, the circumference of which varies widely, but the center of which is fixed and unified and whole. At once, everywhere and nowhere. Close your eyes and relax. Find a comfortable place. Balance yourself. You want to sit up straight, but not rigid. You don't use muscular tension to hold yourself up. Instead, think of yourself as balanced, with your shoulders back, your rib cage open. Most people benefit from raising their chin just a little bit and get your head centered above your neck and shoulders, the spine. Whether seated cross-legged on a pillow or sitting in a chair or a sofa. Align yourself vertically in a balanced and comfortable position, and take a few slow, deep breaths as you close your eyes and create and sense the feeling of relaxation. 3 messages. Conscious mind speaking to subconscious. I'm closing my eyes. Message number 1, I must be safe. I'm taking a few slow, deep breaths, so I must be safe. And the 3rd message, I'm feeling and sensing in my body a letting go, a relaxation, so I'm obviously very safe now. And therefore, speaking to the brain or the subconscious mind, the body itself, my eyes are closed, my breathing is slow and deep, deliberate. I'm feeling safe and relaxed. You can allow me to concentrate and focus my attention. And so the mind becomes quiet as you turn your breathing over to autopilot and allow your body to automatically or autonomically regulate itself. And you create and sense from head to toe a letting go feeling of peace and relaxation and safety. And center yourself in the present, not the past or the future, where our mental and even emotional nature sometimes tends to drag us. By placing your attention on the bottom of your nose, you breathe in the present moment. And if you gently place your attention between the nostrils, you become aware of the reality of this unfolding moment. and feel the beauty and the majesty and the power effortlessly of experiencing the full reality of the eternal now. The present moment. With every breath, with every beat of your heart, you remain balanced in the present. This is the center of the circle. For while the circle may be cycling and spinning like a record or a CD, around and around and around, as you move toward the center, things become less chaotic, less of this physical world, moving toward the perfect peace and rest at the ultimate center of the circle. And by looking at a pie slice of that circle, we see it as the apex or the peak of the pendulum. For though the bottom swings to and fro, or even around and around, as you move up the string toward the top of the pendulum or the center of the circle, you go slower. Things are less chaotic. You move from relative toward absolute, from diversity, which remains, toward a focus on unity. From the material world, where all seems separated and discrete, toward the principle of unification and the one thing, the one life. The all one, as opposed to this one or that one. It's this one and that one. Or is like the circumference of the circle, move to the center and experience the and know that this and that is true. Absolutes would be the domain of spirit, of the source, the center of all that is. And as you radiate out toward time and space, you move into the domain of the relatively true, the relatively right and wrong, the matters of degree. And you see how simple the concept really is. And as you sit at the center of the circle, you remind yourself that this is your refuge, that this is where you seek clarity and understanding by moving to the center, from which all things that are not the center spring, are born of, and depend upon. Sit in the center and know the peace and the silence and the rest, the eternity and the infinity of this singular point of simultaneous existence and non-existence, of everything and nothing. Your refuge, your home, your nirvana, your heaven, the absolute center of the circle, of the sphere, of the globes and the rounds, Be the center. Be in the center of space, right here. In the center of time, right now. A being in the present moment that is eternity and infinity. The mountaintop, the top of the pyramid, the capstone, the top of the pendulum, the reason people look up when they think of heaven or hold their hands palms up as if receptive to a downward precipitation. Be the source. Identify with the peace. For this is awareness. This is love. This is understanding. This is truth. And it is peace. It is awareness. It is the essence of existence. Find your refuge here when your life gets crazy and when you're confused, when it's spinning madly all around you and you have no idea what else to do. Come here to the center within you. And know wherever you are, wherever you go, however you may feel, whatever you may think, this center is always available to you. In the center of your being, your heart and your soul. Your center. And bring this feeling with you, this understanding of where you can find your safety and your refuge as you take a slow, deep breath, filling your lungs. And now as you exhale, open your eyes, wide awake, alert, back in the room, feeling fine, even better than before. All right, well, that's a lot of information. I do hope that you'll keep the URL and the password to this premium training, maybe even download the MP3. It's all pretty obvious on the website there. And then you can put it in your collection of MP3s on your computer and, listen to it on your portable MP3 player if you'd like, your smartphone or iPod or whatever. Listen to it repeatedly. It'll really help you, not only to understand for your own benefit, but then to share with your frightened friends. You need to understand that this belief in absolutes to the exclusion of diversity and relativity is largely promoted by fear. And so the idea that anything that's different is a threat, that's a fear response. So your love as consciousness, as awareness, as understanding can neutralize that fear. And you can help people feel safe as you bring light into the darkness of their existence with just some of these concepts. Okay? It's and, not or. Ta-da! Mahalo in Hawaiian means thank you, my gratitude and appreciation for you being here. I hope you'll join us on a regular basis. Consider enrolling for a 13-week quarter or maybe enjoy the discount of enrolling for a full year at theagelesswisdom.com. Remember the THE, the W's, theagelesswisdom.com. And visit our social net. Put Ning just before the .com. It's the W's theagelesswisdom.ning.com, N-I-N-G. And it's ad-free, free to join, free to use social net with discussion groups and blogs and cool videos and photos and friending opportunities. And there's just a few hundred of us in here, but it's growing every day, and it's dedicated to people like you who are looking to be more aware, to grow who you are, and to become more active socially and ethically, politically out into the world. Be gentle, love life, and take care of each other. This is Michael Benner. Aloha from Maui, Hawaii.